welcome to the Scope 3 information session on Scope 3 guidance for telecommunication operators. It is a pleasure to have you all here in this session. This session is being organized by GSMA, GeSI, and ITU. And the objective of the session is to present the guidance for telecommunication operators that has been worked on for several months, and some of you have participated. So allow me to provide some rules. If you can move to the next slide. There will be an opportunity for question and answer after the presentation of each category and a final question and answer at the end. Please use the please use the box that says question and answer at the top of my meetings of Teams. And there you can write your question. A recording of this webinar and the presentation will be available to all participants on our website, and we will share the link in the chat. Now allow me to present a video with opening remarks from Mr. Bilal Jamousi, Chief of ITUT Study Group Department from the International Telecommunication Union. Barnica, there's no sound.
Oh, sorry, 1 second.
Questions, I'd like to take a moment to express my gratitude. It's a pleasure to be here today with you all. Before we dive into the discussions, I'd like to take a moment to express my gratitude to some of the key players who have made this session possible. First, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to GeSI and GSMA for collaborating and putting together this information session. Moreover, I'd like to express my appreciation to the experts from Study Group 5 of ITUT that works on developing international standards for EMF, environment, climate action, sustainable digitization, and circular economy. Particularly, question 9 of Study Group 5, the working group on climate change and assessment of digital technologies in the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement, as well as the rapporteurs who have been instrumental in shaping the guidance that will be discussed today. It's my pleasure to welcome those of you who are joining us from all over the world. Your presence here today demonstrates the global reach and impact of this important topic. Today in the morning, we had a productive session, morning of Geneva, of course. We had a productive session with participants joining us worldwide. The telecommunication and more broadly digital industry is essential in our modern lives and is growing rapidly. However, with growth comes challenges, and it's essential for the industry to take action on its impact to the environment. The ITU, in collaboration with GSMA and GeSI, have developed a guide to harmonize methods for telecommunication operators to assess and report their Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions and increase coverage and transparency. This guide is crucial in helping the ICT sector to achieve the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. It's a significant step towards reducing GHG emissions and mitigating climate change. As significant players in the industry, telecommunications operators and their providers play a key role in decarbonizing the ICT sector. This guide will assist telecommunication operators in understanding their upstream and downstream emissions, identifying areas where they can reduce their footprint, and launching action in cooperation with their providers in reducing greenhouse emissions and the whole value chain. The collaboration with GSMA and GeSI is a continuation of the great work done in the development of the standard. We call it Recommendation ITUT L.1470. greenhouse gas emissions trajectories for the information and communication technology sector, compatible with the UN FCCC Paris Agreement, which provides detailed 1.5 Celsius trajectory of greenhouse gas emission for the global information and communication technology ICT sector by 2030. This collaboration complements the effort to develop the ICT sector to lower its emission by 2030. We are committed to making sure that collectively we achieve the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. In view of COP28 asking for solutions and actions, this guide is timely, and the industry is ready to take the necessary steps to mitigate climate change. Although this guide covers the part of the telecommunication operators, ITU together with GeSI will continue the collaboration to work on the guidance for other key players, such as data center operators. We will continue working towards creating a sustainable future through the transformation and enablement of ICTs and digital technologies to support other sectors to reach net zero. With that, I hope you will have an enjoyable information session today. Thank you.
Many thanks to Mr. Jamousi that has provided his remarks. Now, I would like to give the floor to Stephen Moore, from Head of Climate Action from GSMA, to provide us some remarks. Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Reina. It's really great to be here, actually, and to have reached the day where we're officially launching this guidance. So thank you very much for joining us. As a small bit of history, the origin of GSMA's work on this guidance can be stemmed or tracked back to 2019. And in 2019, the board of the GSMA, so representing some of the largest telecommunication operators globally, set a net zero ambition for the industry, and that was to be net zero by 2050. And we then, from this ambition, we engaged in a joint collaboration with GeSI and the ITU to develop a pathway to net zero carbon emissions for the whole of the ICT sector. Since we published that pathway, the GSMA has seen many of our members, mobile network operators, align to it, and there are now more than 60 committed to science-based targets globally. With a commitment to science-based targets comes a requirement to measure Scope 3 emissions. And over the last couple of years, the feedback from our members has been that this is proving very difficult. It's very difficult to measure. So actually back in 2021, we created this project group with GSMA members to see if we could work together to improve measurement of Scope 3. One of the first things that we looked at was how our members are currently measuring Scope 3 emissions. What really surprised us was actually that the figures were quite different, the output figures of measurement. So fast forward to now, and I'm very happy to be collaborating with GeSI and the ITU again, and to be launching this guidance. Our project leads are going to explain how to use it and how to interpret some of it. But I'd just like to say a huge thanks to the project management team of Jean-Manuel, of Simon, Alex, Chris, John, Varnika and Reina, who have definitely steered this project to its conclusion. I also want to thank all of the project members that have contributed to developing this guidance, because it's taken many meetings and a huge amount of time. But I very much hope that you'll find this session useful, and it will be another big step forward in helping to meet our net zero ambition. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Now I would like to give the floor to Chris Toppen from the Global Enabling Sustainability Initiative to provide us some remarks.
Thank you very much, Reina, and good evening, good morning, if any of you are on morning still. I'm very much from GeSI's point of view, welcome to this call. The history behind GeSI's involvement is that one of the GeSI members 2 or 3 years ago now was interested in how other companies were addressing the category 8 and 13 leased assets categories for the scope 3 emissions. And what we discovered after doing a small survey was that people in different companies were interpreting it in quite different ways often. And further to that, we discovered that the greenhouse gas protocol wasn't always self-consistent in what it advised. And not only that, that even where companies had had external auditors or verifiers come in to verify their accounts, the verifiers were also taking different opinions and approaches. So it clearly needed some resolution and some consistency put in place. And we approached the WRI, they supported us in doing the work. And at that point, we discovered that the ITU and the GSMA were already also looking at scope 3. So as others have said, building on the very successful collaboration that we had undertaken previously on the science-based target trajectories. We joined forces again and have resulted in the guidance that we are approaching today. If any of you were on the SBTI technical update call yesterday, and there were hundreds of people around the world on that call, there were lots of Q's and A's going on as the presentations were taking place, and it is quite clear that guidance on scope 3 is absolutely required, and what we have produced here, I think, is absolutely timely to support people in putting forward their SBTs. So as you've already heard, the plans are to take forward the guidance that we have got so far on for telecommunications operators and evolve it further to address the specific concerns of data center operators as well. And John Pfluger, who is on the call with us today, will lead that piece of work within GeSI, and again, we'll welcome collaboration across the groups with that. So it just remains for me to thank everyone, also on behalf of GeSI, for all the great work that, and collaboration that's taken us to where we are today. So let me return the floor to Rainer. Thank you, Rainer.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to you and to Stephen for the words. Now, allow me to provide you a brief overview of the agenda of today. First, we will have an overview of the guidance document. Then we will go to categories 1 and 2 on purchase, goods, service, and CapEx. A brief explanation on category 11, use of sold products. Categories 8 and 13 on upstream, downstream, and leased assets. Then an explanation on all other categories, and a final question and answer. Please note that in each session there will be a moment for question and answer, so please feel free to put them in the question and answer box. As we are not many participants this time, maybe you could also put in the chat from where you are connecting and which organization you represent. That will be great to also to understand from where you are connecting with us. Thank you, and I will give the floor now to Jean-Manuel Canet, co-rapporteur of question 9 from ITUT and senior manager of Orange, that will provide an introduction to the scope 3 guidance. Jean-Manuel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Reina, and very happy to be with you this evening, this afternoon, this morning, to give you this overview of the guidance document and some key messages. So what results from this joint work we have been doing is that we intended to establish, let's say, a common guidance and to harmonize methods for telecommunication operators to assess and report their Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions with the ambition to increase coverage and transparency. And so this is what was our motivation in preparing this guidance document in the context where, as it was just mentioned some minutes ago, estimating Scope 3 emissions is difficult since this refers to emission sources which are outside a company's direct control, and it involves a wide range of economic activities that are divided by the GEG protocol, as you probably know, into 15 categories. So this guidance prioritizes in particular the categories 1, 2, and 11. And these three categories, they address the life cycle impact of companies' portfolios. The guidance also prioritizes the categories 8 and 13, which are related to leased assets, and the category 3, which is closely linked to Scope 1 and 2, being linked to energy. At the same time, all categories are addressed in the guidance, so the intention has been that all the categories of the GEG protocol are covered. The document is intended to supplement, not supersede, the existing standards. Varnika, if you could please. Thank you so much. Go to the next slide. So here we just put a reminder of the GEG protocol Scope 3 categories. So you have them here in front of you. These Scope 3 categories are often referred to as upstream activities and downstream activities. And you have here the graph directly coming from the GEG protocol. So the guidance is following this categorization from the GEG protocol. If we could please go to the next slide. So we intended to share with you now the guiding principles of the guidance. You will find these guiding principles directly written in the guidance, and here they are. So the first guiding principle is the goal is reduction. That is to say that estimating Scope 3 emissions should be used to drive reduction efforts. We all know the urgency of reducing GHG emissions. The recent report from the IPCC has emphasized again the need for urgency. The events that we are suffering, unfortunately, already all around the world, they remind us how urgent it is to act and to reduce emissions. So the goal is reduction. Second guiding principle is hotspotting, that is to say, to focus time and effort on largest emission sources. So to be able to find where are the largest emission sources and to focus time and effort on that. Keep it simple. So use the simplest approach that will give required accuracy and best support reduction goals. The scale, covering more emissions, can help with business decisions. Improve accuracy over time. Scope 3 is complex, and data availability and quality will be improving year after year. Suitable for all, that is to say, the document contains approaches for both beginners and those more advanced. Then follow science-based principle. So the document is directly related to net zero standards from ISO. from the Science Based Targets Initiative and also ITUT recommendations. And last but not least, focus on mitigation. Carbon offsets, whether purchased by the telecommunication operator or supplier customers, shall not be considered as valid means of reducing CO2 equivalent inventories. And this is perfectly in line with the standards and recommendation that we have just that I've just mentioned. So this was it for the introduction and some key messages and guiding principles. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Jean-Manuel, for this introduction. It seems that so far there are no questions. I saw some two messages from the chat that you are joining us from Canada and also from the US. And now I will give you the floor to Simon Anthony, Senior Supplier Governance Manager of Telstra. Simon is joining from Australia, so for him it's like 6:20 in the morning. So thank you, Simon, for being here, and thank you for having the time to go through these categories. The floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Raina. Before I get started, I would like to thank everyone that contributed to this guidance across all the three organizations. Unfortunately, I don't have time to list everyone. However, a special thank you to Jana from A1 Telecom, Witold from Telenor, Wilfred from Zane, and Penella from Ericsson. So as we've already discussed, category 1 and 2 are significant for telecommunication operators. And therefore, it's no surprise that it is one of the largest sections in this guidance. The intention of today was I'll be highlighting some of the key points in this section, and it's not designed to be a comprehensive overview of the guidance. However, as mentioned, we have 10 minutes straight after for some Q&A on category 1 and 2. The guidance itself is intended to build on different standards and practices. However, we did find some of the standards and practices don't always align. So at times, we have had to agree on which standards and practices we want to align with following those principles just discussed. Probably one of the most obvious decisions is that we chose to combine category 1 and 2 of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. These are the cradle-to-gate emissions of all purchased products and capital goods, not included in categories 3 to 8, all listed under the special exclusion section, which I'll talk about in a moment. The intention behind combining these two categories was that it would seem to be more efficient and aligned with the procurement practices in operator organizations. However, I should be clear that the emissions themselves, when reporting them, should be reported as either category 1 or 2, and therefore should not be double accounted for. And to help determine whether to account for a purchase in category 1 or 2, we recommend that companies follow their financial accounting classifications. So for example, operational expenditure would be reported in category 1, and capital expenditure would be reported in category 2. Within the guidance, we've also provided definitions, and there are a number of examples relevant to the sector. Moving on to the next line on special exclusions, we did spend a lot of time discussing what should be excluded. We started with the base position that as a telecom operators, we have responsibility for all of our upstream emissions. However, we found that there were two types of payments which we agreed on that telecom operators may exclude. The first was regulatory payments, fees, charges, etc. So any type of payments required by under a legal requirement or regulation. And then the second was intercompany transactions. And I'd suggest referring to the guidance for further details on these two payments. There were also several other payments which were heavily debated. Namely, this included roaming agreements, interconnects, content or media licenses. Unfortunately, we weren't able to kind of come to an agreement on guidance within this time frame or this guidance. However, we did recognise that there are a number of challenges in accounting for these payments, and that the approaches differ greatly between different telecommunication operators. And then as well as the need to further work in the future to align on specific guidance for this. So the next line largely relates to the depreciation of capital goods. We took the position that to ensure timely reporting of emissions, companies should report their category 1 and 2 emissions in the year of purchase. And within this guidance, it's recommended that emissions from the production of capital goods should not be depreciated, discounted, or amortized. As a result of this approach, we recognise some emissions may fluctuate from year to year due to purchases of exceptional or non-recurring capital goods. And in such cases, it's recommended that companies should provide some commentary to help explain these variations. So the fourth point is in regards to reused, refurbished, or repaired goods. This was a relatively new area, and as we worked through it, we found that there were a number of complexities involved with accounting for these emissions. And we're seeing the thinking in this area continuing to evolve as of now. So please take that as a bit of a disclaimer. But nevertheless, there was an ask to provide guidance. So first of all, what do we mean by reused, refurbished, and repaired goods? So we provided a bit of a definition, and as per the guidance, this is that any items of property that were previously owned by another company and restored when necessary to a usable condition prior to purchase by the telecom operator. What this does not include, however, are goods that are being purchased or acquired by a telecom operator as new after a cosmetic refurbishment where the item has not been used. And the intention here was to avoid any claims that the guidance may allow for any washing of emissions. How should we account for reused, refurbished, or repaired goods? The guidance recommends that these emissions should not include the emissions that arose from the original manufacturing. So we'd only be accounting for the emissions that arise from any further processing, such as the emissions occurred to make the goods reusable. Once again, we have a couple of examples within the guidance to hopefully provide further clarity, so please refer to the guidance for further details. So probably the next significant change you would notice from the greenhouse gas protocol is how we've referred to the different methods. I'll just briefly talk about the process that we went to agree on these. So as mentioned earlier in their introduction, a piece of work was performed quite early in the process to understand how companies are calculating their emissions. And what we found was that there were 3 common methods companies are using to calculate their emissions, and that these 3 methods differ from the most general and simplistic method to those more specific and detailed. These 3 methods were based on the greenhouse gas protocol. However, we found they were more aligned with the practices of telecommunication operators, as well as some of those principles that we discussed earlier, especially around how can we reduce emissions and hotspotting as well. So in the guidance, we referred to these 3 methods based on their emission sources, and therefore the level operators are required to reduce those emissions. So this includes the industry average method, the supplier level allocation method, and the product level method. We also say that companies may use different calculation methods for different suppliers. And furthermore, companies may use different calculation methods for different purchases from the same supplier. So for example, where a supplier provides something such as network equipment and maintenance, the company may use methods that are more specific, so such as the product method for the equipment, and use less specific methods for the maintenance, such as something like the industry average or supply level allocation. So the first of the three methods in the industry average method uses secondary emission sources, so industry average data or EEIO factors. We found this to be the most common and time efficient method as the data requirements were less onerous. And we also found it particularly helpful for hotspotting. One challenge, though, with this method that was quite obvious is that the only way to reduce emissions using this method is to reduce activity, which is not always an efficient way to be running our organizations or reducing emissions. Therefore, a key focus was on how can we shift away from this method to more informative methods. So the next one was the supplier level allocation method, which involves collecting data from suppliers, usually at a company level, but the guidance is written so that it could be done at different levels within suppliers as well. So whether that's at the factory level or function level or otherwise. Obviously, one of the challenges with this method is that collecting emissions data from suppliers can add considerable time and cost burden. Therefore, the recommendation is that you should be prioritizing the collection of such products and capital goods that have relatively high emissions or where suppliers are strategically relevant to your organization. And a very practical recommendation is that companies should aim to gradually improve their emissions data over time, starting with that industry average method and hotspotting, but working with suppliers to obtain that supplier level data. And then the last method was the product level method. This was set out in a way that it is not intended to be a detailed LCA, as we saw that as not being a very pragmatic solution to obtain this type of information. But in the context of this document, looking at what we've referred to as a simplified LCA, what I would acknowledge is that we did have a question this morning, was in that is there guidance on how to calculate product level, not within this guidance document. However, the ITU study group is working on guidance for a simplified LCA. What we do provide in the guidance is the benefits and challenges for each of these different methods, which I would recommend referring to before utilizing any of them. Barnika, are you able to move to the next slide, please? We've also provided a bit of a decision flow to help organizations identify when to use each of the different methods. So as mentioned, kind of the first step would be go through supplier screening to identify those suppliers that emissions are significant or where they would place a strategic importance to the organization. From there, it is largely based on what data you're able to obtain from the supplier, as well as the how the quality of that data you're obtaining. And one thing that we talk about in the document is that when determining the most appropriate calculation method, that companies should be using some following minimum indicators as a guide to assess whether the emissions data is of sufficient quality. So, for example, when using the supplier allocation method, we should be looking to ensure that we're obtaining complete data from suppliers. So the suppliers category 1, 2 and upstream emissions of scope 1, scope 2, and their upstream emissions from Scope 3. As well as doing some checks to verify or ensure that that data has been verified as well. And then the last guidance that we provide in the document is the calculation methods and how to calculate emissions using each of these different methods. And you'll find in the appendix, there's also a number of examples around the supplier allocation method as well. So I will stop there and open the floor for questions.
So we have Simon to question in the chat. It seems that there is a problem with the question and answer box. So one of the question is, what about taxes as an exclusion?
Yes, so that would fall under regulatory payments, and I think we call out taxes as a specific example. So that would be something that's being excluded.
Then another question from Andrea Nimmer Soto. Are there any companies using physical activity data and product level or supplier level calculation? If so, any chance they could share any details of the tools they use? She's from T-Mobile, Frisco, Texas.
Yeah, that's a great question. We didn't exactly go through the different tools to collect product level data, but obviously that's an area that, yeah, as mentioned, is being explored further, especially the guidance around that by the ITU. So yeah, I'd be very interested as well in that.
So this is John Pfluger from Dell. We have some experience with some of these, and most frequently we are using data that we're getting from our suppliers on their climate performance through the CDP supply chain program. And we'll use that, and at the moment we use a financial allocation model to determine our share of their emissions. But one of the other things that we're interested in as well is not just our share of their scope 1 and 2, but our share of their scope 3 category 1, because category 1, goes upstream all the way to resource extraction. And we have found that data spotty. We get that data from some suppliers, but not from all. So we will use EEIO data, looking at industry averages and EEIO data and our spend with that supplier to get something along the lines of data from the industry average method. From a product point of view, we do a lot of work on product carbon footprinting. So we have product level data. One of the things that we have found, though, is if you do a product data based calculation, look at everything you sell and the carbon footprint of that models will give you for different things, we do not get the same number as when we use the supplier level method. And our belief is that the product level methods are overestimating footprint because they tend to be based on older models, and we see more changes in the supply. We see the supply chain changing fairly rapidly, so the databases are not able to keep up. But with the supplier data, we think that they're underestimating footprint because we don't think that they're going all the way back to resource extraction. And so one of the other things is we do view these as gradually increasing in accuracy. And so it is important to us that we use, we choose our methods on a supplier by supplier basis, because we won't have every last supplier enable us to go from industry average to supplier level at the same time. We'll see some suppliers that are more advanced and we'll be able to work with them on more accurate numbers, and then we'll have to work with the other suppliers to get them to a point where we can get more accurate data from them.
Yeah, thank you, John. So yeah, great point, and I highly recommend that, as you go through considering the benefits and challenges, a lot of the things that John discussed are all documented in the guidance as well for each of the different methods. Raina, was there any other questions?
Not yet. It was just a comment from Andrea that it would be great to have a special workshop to share best practices. So maybe that we could also discuss. But right now there's no more questions. So, and the question and answer. Wait, I was talking too fast. There seems there is one question. Are any recommendations on how to manage Scope 3 carbon accounting when moving away from EEIO to supplier data via CDP, especially when looking on the annual report on SBT?
On managing Scope 3 accounting when moving away, maybe just to kind of clarify, if we're referring to how to calculate those emissions.
Let us see if Natalia, can you please provide more clarification on the question? Or maybe as we are not so many, Barnica, will it be possible to give Natalia access to the microphone so she can clarify?
Sure.
Natalia Bolaños. She said yes when there is an increase when moving from EEIO to CDP data.
Yes, good question. There is some guidance in the document on not just, I guess, that case in particular, but on all cases in terms of when you're moving or changing methods, or as we see the data from our suppliers improve, we're going to see, in cases emissions change because in the change of data and not actual, emissions changing. So what we're recommending there is that organizations, if the change is significant, look to rebaseline, but that is not a pragmatic if we're talking about lots of small changes. So to be more transparent in your reporting to indicate what's coming from changes in data quality versus, real activity or emission reductions.
Maybe I could just chip in on that, Simon, Chris here, because that question was asked on the SBTI call yesterday, and SBTI actually gave a response to the question. And their answer was that a recalculation would be triggered if the data changes result in more than 5% total change in emissions in that scope, and suggests seeing criterion C26 in the validation protocol, which gives you more information on this.
Oh, great. Thank you, Chris.
Are there any more questions? Maybe we have still time. So no, just Natalia saying great, thanks. Okay, so it seems that there are no more questions. So thank you so much, Simon, and thank you again for your availability at this time. So I think we can release you, and I hope don't come with questions for category 1 and 2 later. Now I would like to give the floor to Chris Toppen, that from GeSI, that will explain category 8 on upstream lease asset and category 13 on downstream lease assets. Chris, you have the floor. Chris? Oh, you are on mute.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. I'll have to put my camera on. Yeah.
Thank you.
So let me start off with a little bit of terminology. And here, category 8, this accounts for emissions associated with upstream leased assets. That is when the telecommunication operator rents assets from another party. And in that case, the telecommunications operator is referred to as the lessee in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Category 13 accounts for emissions associated with downstream leased assets. That is, assets that are let to another party by the telecommunications operator. And in that case, the operator would be termed the lessor. We have combined the guidance for these because essentially they're two sides of the same coin. So in other words, the guidance for upstream and the guidance for downstream complement each other. And in the guidance itself, we have provided some examples of where the telecoms operator may be both the lessee or the lessor. So, for example, and particularly with mobile operators, tower cos and renting space in a tower is a very common activity. So if you are a network operator renting cell tower capacity, then you would be the lessee. On the other hand, if you actually have towers that you are renting capacity in, you would be the lessor. And there are similar examples on data center operators as well, because some telcos also run data centers and offer space in those data centers to customers. And in that case, you would be the lessor. And you may even rent yourself space from one of the big data center operators, and in which case you'd be the lessee. So it all sort of wraps together, category 8 and 13. One of the areas that we spent a lot of time looking at, and I should say that the content in this chapter has derived valuable inputs both from the telecoms operators and the data center operators that are involved in the GeSI carbon accounting working group. So we've had a richness of debate here, and it's been influenced by both the network operators and the data center operators. And one of the really big issues that came forward in our conversations was the first step in really understanding how to account for leased assets is that effectively one party should be reporting the emissions as scope 1 and 2, and the other party would be reporting emissions as scope 3. And therefore, the allocation of emissions between the first party and the second party, and who takes the responsibility for reporting as scope 1 and 2, is important. And when we went back to the greenhouse gas protocol, and as is shown and described in detail in the guidance, it actually was quite unclear in some cases how that allocation should take place. On occasion, the greenhouse gas protocol was even inconsistent within itself, and we discovered occasions when neither party, if you strictly followed the greenhouse gas protocol, neither party would report the emissions of scope 1 and 2, and also occasions when both parties would be accounting and reporting them as scope 1 and 2. So clearly this doesn't make much sense. And the sort of parameters that one has to look at in this is firstly the way in which the company sets its organizational boundaries, whether it's an equity share, financial control, or operational control. and secondly, the type of lease, whether it's a capital lease or a finance lease, also termed a finance lease, or whether it's an operating lease. And I won't go into the detail here, but again, it's all there in the guidance notes. There is, though, an acceptance within the greenhouse gas protocol that allows a way through this, and that is that the greenhouse gas protocol allows a clarification of the rights and responsibilities associated with these emissions to be placed in the leasing contract. And we therefore have recommended that the best way to ensure that at least one party is reporting it as scope 1 and 2 and the other party reports it as scope 3 is for the two parties to reach agreement within the leasing contract as to how that happens. And this is fully compliant with the greenhouse gas protocol. And therefore, this is one of our key recommendations. There may be occasions when some of the emissions are reported as scope 1 and 2 by one party, and some of them are reported by another party. So, for example, in the case of the tower co's, the company putting the equipment, the lessee putting the equipment within the tower, could take the scope 1 and 2 emissions for operating the equipment, whereas the company operating the tower and the shared services within the tower, such as the cooling, could take the scope 1 and 2 for those shared services. So you have this sort of mix of attributions, but that's perfectly possible to put that within the contract. So then there comes a point of whose responsibility is it to actually measure the emissions, and here we recommend that the entity reporting the emissions of scope 1 and 2 measure those and inform the other party who would be reporting it as a scope 3. And then finally, we have been working with the Chancery Lane project. This is a project of lawyers who help provide draft contract clauses to address issues around climate change. And when we contacted them to discuss what we were doing, they offered their services to help draft some clauses that met the recommendations and the guidance that we put together in these guidance notes. And those are nearly complete now, and in the final designed version of the guidance, we will have the URL which will take you to the Chancery Lane project to be able to pick up those draft clauses, and you'll be able to then amend them and put them in your own contracts to address these issues. So that's an overview of where we've got to on categories 8 and 13. And very happy to take any questions if there are any.
For the time being, I don't see any question on the chat, but let us see the question and answer box. No, no questions.
Well, maybe I could quickly invite John Fluger just if he would like.
There is a.
Okay.
Can you re-explain the example of the lessor and sorry, I have problem with that word. Let's see on how to account for emissions in the draft agreements, please.
Yeah. So essentially, by the draft agreement, I assume that you're referring to the contract between the lessor and the lessee. So the suggested way is to review the greenhouse gas protocol guidance, and if that works if following the greenhouse gas guidance and the way that is leading to an attribution, and both parties agree to that, then that is the way that you probably should put it within your contract. If, however, you get into one of these situations where there is confusion, or indeed one of the parties feels that it would be better to address the attributions in a slightly different way, then it's up to both parties by agreement to agree the attribution between themselves. So there's no specific and mandated way of doing this, but the only thing that should happen is that at least one of the parties is reporting any of the emissions as scope 1 and 2, and also to avoid any occurrence of both parties reporting them as scope 1 and 2. So I hope that answers the question, but please do read through the guidance notes, and if it's not clear, by all means, come back to us and we can clarify it further.
Then there was another question. If one of the parties is not reporting on its GHG emissions, should the other party automatically report emissions as scope 1 and scope 2?
Not necessarily. If one of the parties is the party that really should be reporting them as scope 1 and 2, but is not doing so, then as the reporting party, I think what you should try and do is at least get the relevant data to calculate those emissions. So it might be like the energy consumption data, for example. So even though they may not have reported it, get hold of the base data and make the calculations yourself.
So Chris, I'll add to that a little bit. The determination of whether or not you report, let's just say, emissions related to electricity used is determined by kind of what sort of control boundary you use for your greenhouse gas accounting, whether it's financial control or operational control. If we'll take the operational control option as the main example. So one of the areas so if you are not, if you cannot claim to be an operational control of a product that uses electricity and has associated carbon emissions, then you should not be reporting it as either scope 1 or scope 2. It would go under some category of scope 3. And that would be the ruling whether or not the other party in the contract or the other party in the exchange is reporting at all, right? So it's not that if they don't report, you have to report scope 2. It's technically it's whoever has operational control. One of the challenges we found, which really suggests using contract language to clarify things, is let's use the example of a server in a data center. So it's a Dell places a server in a co-location data center and delivers services to a third party. So who has operational control of that server? You could make a case that says the colo has operational control of the server because they control the power into the building, and then therefore they control the application of power to the server. You could also claim that Dell has operational control because Dell is managing the server and has the ability to turn it on or off and determines what it's going to do. So the greenhouse gas protocol really doesn't help us in these sorts of situations. And you know, it led to a lot of discussions when we couldn't come up with an answer. Well, the reason why we couldn't come up with an answer is because the guidance isn't clear. So in that case, what we would recommend is just deciding, and what we're looking for is we want to make sure that all emissions that are scope 2 related, created as a result of supplying energy, are counted exactly once. And ideally, they're all counted once. So you would use contract language to assign, you know, to come to an agreement as to who would consider the emissions their scope 2, and then the other party to the contract would be scope 3. But whether they would categorize it under category 8 or category 13 would be dependent on whether they are upstream or downstream. So if the co-location operator is going to declare it as scope 2, then Dell, who is utilizing the services provided by the co-location provider, would view that as an upstream leased asset, and so the emissions would be related to category 8. If it were Dell who were deemed to be in operational control, then Dell would be responsible for scope 2, and the co-location provider would then say, okay, these are emissions associated with downstream leased assets, so category 13. So that's also one of the reasons why we say category 8 and category 13 are really mixed together. One specific sort of situation where the greenhouse gas protocol literally doesn't, it issues conflicting guidance, is if you have a contract between two parties, or you have an arrangement between two parties, and one of the parties uses financial control as their way to determine their accounting boundary, and the other party to the contract uses operational control. And when that happens, you can easily end up with situations where they both parties think they're supposed to be responsible for scope 2, or neither party thinks they're supposed to be responsible for scope 2. So once again, the greenhouse gas protocol does provide us a way out of that, which is that you're allowed to determine what the accounting rules can be in contract, leading to the wonderful work, Chris, that you're doing with the Chancery Lane project.
Thank you, John. And so that's a further sort of explanation. So you've had it twice now, and hopefully that all makes sense. So thank you, John, for putting that in.
You're welcome. It's confusing to those of us who have discussed it 100 times.
I know it is, yeah. So just if Rainer, I see there's one final question here. Where Ingrid says, so if the lessee is reporting them as scope 1 and 2, the lessor would need to report them as scope 3. And the answer is essentially yes, unless the lessor didn't agree with that allocation, in which case the two parties would need to discuss it between them and resolve the situation, and whatever that resolution turns out to be would go into the contract. But again, as John was saying, you know, the first port of call is to follow the greenhouse gas protocol as much as one can. But if that doesn't work, then you know, use the contract language to resolve the issue.
Thank you, Chris. It seems that there are no more questions. I don't know if you want to provide some more comments, or we can move ahead. Oh, sorry. There is a question from
Another
Ingrid.
one.
You want to read it, Chris? You have.
What about the third party who's receiving the service? This is about Dell, so I'll leave John to answer the question.
So I think what the way we would look at that is, as well, that's upstream. So that party would also categorize it under scope 3 category 8. So you can have situations where you've got two parties that are reporting under scope 3 category 8, which is okay because scope 3 is not supposed to add up to 100%. It's supposed to be shared. Or you could end up with a situation where one party is looking at scope 2, one party considers it to be scope 3 category 8, one party considers it to be scope 3 category 13. So it's all dependent upon where you are in the value chain.
Great answer. Thank you, John. And thank you, Rainer. And we'll move on to the next category.
Great. So now I will give the floor to Alex Campbell, Senior Sustainability Consultant from TDC Net. Alex will explain to us category 11 on use of sold products. Alex, you have the floor.
Thank you, Reina. So hello, everyone, and thanks for attending. I'd like to also give a special thanks to all the people on the project team who helped put this together, which include people from KPN and Telefonica. When we set out to do this project more than a year and a half ago, there were quite a number of questions that came up related to category 11. It seemed that there were a lot of divergences in the ways that different operators were calculating their emissions. They were classifying it under different categories. They were using different methods that, it wasn't exactly clear whether they were legitimate or not. So this was actually one where there was a lot of discussion that needed to happen for us to be able to provide further guidance on the use of sold products. So right now I'll break down the 5 main challenges that the operator saw, how those challenges were overcome, and then what that means for your carbon inventory and how the recommended solution can actually be used as a reduction lever. So first, the greenhouse gas protocol method is labor intensive for devices with low emissions from the use phase. So just to refresh your memories, when you take a look at category 11 and the greenhouse gas protocol, the method they say is you have to take a look at the power consumption of the device over the year. So that would be, all the different modes or power modes that the device can have and the user profiles. And then you multiply that by the lifetime of the device. Now, if you do this for mobile phones specifically, you'll see that a lot of operators are selling, 100 plus different kinds of mobile devices every year. They all have different battery capacities, and it actually takes a lot of work to figure out what's the use phase emissions from the mobile devices. And this can actually take a week or a couple weeks of work every year. And once you do it, you realize that it's less than 1% of your total inventory. So the work that you put in isn't really reflective of the levers that you can actually use to decrease your inventory. So we agreed that we could take a shortcut. And the shortcut here is that if the mobile device being sold has a product carbon footprint or a life cycle assessment, where it shows how much emissions are from the total life cycle of the device, and then you just take a look at the use phase. So for example, Apple will publish for every one of the devices that they sell a product environment report card. So they'll say an iPhone 14 Pro has 65 kilograms of CO2 over its lifetime. In the use phase, there's 15%. So therefore, for every iPhone 14 Pro sold, it's just under 10 kilograms of CO2 per device. And then you multiply how many of those you sold in a year, and you've got your emissions. One consideration to take into account here is that it won't be Apple might use a global emission factor for location-based electricity. So you should always take into account what region and what grid you're using, and seeing if you can adjust for it to be more accurate for where your market is for selling it. And then for all other devices, you can use method 2, which is the method that I just described that's in the greenhouse gas protocol. So in terms of the levers here, what this does is allow you to focus on what matters. So if you know that you're selling something that is not material, but you have to calculate it. Well, you just say that it just meets the threshold of materiality and it's very low. Then you can take this shortcut, and then you don't have to focus on it too much. And then you could place your efforts where it really matters, which is the devices that actually take a lot of energy. So for telcos, that's typically routers or the customer premise equipment, as they call it. So that'd be routers or setup boxes, optical network terminals, etc. The next really big problem that the greenhouse gas protocol had was that there were issues related to circular economy and circularity, in the sense that refurbishment wasn't very well addressed in the greenhouse gas protocol. And it was actually, there were examples where people felt like they were being penalized for doing the right thing. So if you keep a device, if you extend a device's lifetime through a refurbishment program, for example, then using the method 2 above, you would actually get more emissions. So that begs the question, well, why am I getting penalized for doing the right thing? The way that we've come around this is by saying that refurbished devices can have a lower lifetime. And so that means that, for example, you could say that for the first time it's sold, a new device from OEM, that it's 5 years. And then a refurbished device would be 3 years, for example. So then that gives an incentive for a refurbishment program where you can actually have relatively lower CO2 emissions by further increasing your refurbishment. And then in your category 1, as Simon talked about earlier, what you would do is you wouldn't take the cradle to gate emissions for the entire product of the refurbished good, from source to production to refurbishment. You would just take that last bit, that refurbishment process, into consideration, because it should have already been, the cradle to gate emission should have already been accounted the first time that you sold it. So that's sort of a double reduction in category 1 and 11 by increasing your refurbishment program. The next issues that we had is that in the greenhouse gas protocol, it talks a lot about indirect emissions, and it doesn't really give very much guidance on, well, what they are, what they mean for us and the telecommunications operators, or when to include them, or when it does make sense to include them. The recommendation that we give here, the guidance that we give here, is that they are optional and they're recommended to include them where they make sense. We saw that there were different examples between telecommunications operators of when they include indirect emissions. An example could be a content provider. So if you have a TV channel, for example, well, you say, well, you can't watch a TV channel without a TV or a device to watch something, a cell phone or an iPad or laptop or whatever it may be. So that would be an indirect emission. Another thing would be a setup box, so TV box, for example. So you can't watch a TV box without a TV. So TV box, the TV itself would be a optional indirect emission. Another one would be, I mean, you could say that a mobile phone doesn't work to its full extent unless it has a subscription. So therefore, if you just went and bought a cell phone and then bought a mobile subscription, then the provider of the subscription could take all phones on its network in category 11, not just the phones that it sold. So these are just some examples. And one word of caution here, and actually in the morning session, we got a second word of caution on this one. The first word of caution is that indirect emissions can be a little bit tricky because they can increase your inventory with no easy levers for reduction. So for example, if we take the setup box and the TV, you would say, well, we can control which setup boxes we put on the market, but we can't control what TV people buy. So you would have a big chunk of emissions in your inventory, which are TVs. And I mean, there's not much you could do to reduce those. And the second word of caution on this one is that apparently one operator submitted a science-based target and the SBTi told them to remove indirect emissions directly. So, and then to resubmit. So that's one thing. But I mean, take a look at where it makes sense for you, basically. I mean, what we do want to have is a full overview of all the emissions and all of your inventory. But we also don't want to make it more difficult for operators to, unnecessarily more difficult for operators to achieve net zero. The next difficult things that different operators were having is that the lifetimes and the user profiles were difficult to estimate. So what the guidance does here is that it focuses on how to come up with a good lifetime. And what it basically says is the lifetime should try to match as closely as possible to how much it's in operation at the customer site. The guidance also provides some indication of what kind of secondary data can be used if primary data is not available. And in terms of the reduction levers here is essentially the longer that you can keep them in use, the less you have to buy new ones. So there is this this link between category 1, 2, and category 11. And lastly, we saw that these customer premise equipment, for example, routers or TV boxes, some operators are putting them in category 11, some of them are putting it in category 13. And this is because often if you get an internet subscription, for example, the operators would send the router to the customer, and when the customer is done on the contract, they would send the router back to the operator. So it's actually technically a downstream leased asset because it's not sold. But after a lot of discussions, we decided that it actually fits, the method is better suited in category 11. And that's because if you read category 13 in the technical guidance for scope 3, it doesn't give very much detail, as John and Chris were just explaining. Whereas at least for category 11, it gives this method 2 that you can see that we referred to in the first point there, talking about user profiles and such. So to conclude and to sort of bring this all together, you have to take a life cycle approach to these emissions. So first off, limit the amount of purchased new and use refurbished. See, as much as you can, use refurbished. Next, buy energy efficient. So a good way to do this is that next time that your procurement teams are tendering for customer premise equipment, make sure that the bids are evaluated based with a component that's a weighted component for power. And what operators could see is that often the providers of the manufacturers of the CPE, they'll actually send samples to your company, and you can plug them in. You can give them to somebody who knows what they're doing, who can plug them in and do a bunch of benchmarking exercises to figure out what is the most energy efficient. And then you can also compare that to what they say the energy is, because it's not always the case that what it says in the user manual is what the real test, the real case, the real life example is. So it is a good idea of putting together a process in the procurement, in the strategic sourcing process where you do take power into account. And then lastly, which was a bit more difficult to do, but user behavior is something that affects this. So that's one more potential avenue for investigation on how you can actually influence that. And that's it for category 11.
Comment on category 11.
Yep.
So we've been doing this calculation for a good number of years, and we're very familiar with the different challenges involved. I think the WRI and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol have just ended a commenting exercise where people could provide information about possible future directions or future investigations the Greenhouse Gas Protocol should look into. I think one of the things we did mention is some of the issues that we had with the last categories, but another issue that we have mentioned is that right now category 11 is a forward-looking category. In other words, it's based on the expected lifetime energy use of everything that you sell during a reporting period. Another approach to category 11 would be a backwards looking, or actually not backwards, but a current look, which is what are the current emissions associated with the products that are all products that are operating in the field today over the reporting period. And our request to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol was to consider allowing that as a way to calculate category 11, because it gets you over this issue of product lifetimes essentially increasing and then increasing your footprint in a reporting year. So if we have another chance to provide feedback, or any of you are participating in this process, I would keep a lookout for what what's being messaged out, or what sort of activities the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is running over the next few months. And if you're interested in helping to promote that as an option for an approach to category 11, we would appreciate it if you would say something.
Yeah, thanks for that, John. And I mean, it is a very important point to make, and it's one that we had a lot of discussions about when it came to category 11, because a lot of operators actually have field data. So they could say, we can tell you over the course of the year how many were in operation at any given time, and which model they were, what their power consumption was. You use the location-based emission factor, and they can say, we can tell you in the last year exactly how much CO2 was emitted because of our devices. But when you start explaining, about the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the lifetime, you realize that you're coming up with maybe make-believe is a strong word, but you're putting a lot of assumptions and estimations on something which already is very solid data. So it can be a little bit frustrating, but I mean, we had to refer back to the principles that Jean-Manuel was talking about at the beginning, which is that this is meant to sort of reinforce, not supersede, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And for that reason, even though some operators believe strongly that they shouldn't take into account the entire lifetime, that they should just do a backwards-looking approach, we decided in the end that that would be in contradiction to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, so we couldn't use it in the guidance.
Thank you, Alex. It seems, let's give 1 minute or less than a minute, but it seems that there are no questions for you further on category 11. So thank you so much.
Rainer, sorry, there's a question from Ingrid.
It's a question from Ingrid. I didn't see it.
She says,
sorry. I find it strange that routers, for example, which are leased to customers and return back, are being taken under category 11 instead of category 13.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm Ingrid, you're not the only one there. A lot of us think that it's a bit strange, but what we saw in practice when we were comparing the inventories between quite a number of operators is that when operators were putting it in 13, they were all using completely different ways of calculating it. Because I guess that if there isn't good guidance on 13, then it opens up the door to creative accounting. So in an attempt to harmonize the accounting practices across the industry, we decided to stick true to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, regardless of what we think of its effectiveness in certain very specific areas such as this one. We recommend that it goes in category 11.
Thank you, Alex. Now I think, yes, there are no more questions. Okay, and thank you, Alex. Now I would like to give the floor to Jean-Manuel so he can explain the other categories. Jean-Manuel.
Thank you so much, Reina. So I will now go through all other categories and go through the different challenges that that the team wrote together. So the first one is the fact that category 3 related to energy can represent a significant amount of telecom operators emissions. This is related to upstream energy. And so based on the existing GAG protocol text, the guidance describes how to assess category 3 emissions with some details. So you will find some details on how to assess this. Regarding how to reduce category 3 GAG emissions, sourcing renewable energy leads to lower CO2 emissions. So this is a way to reduce your category 3 emissions. The next challenge that we wrote here is the fact that even if not major contributors to scope 3, other categories shall be taken into account. The approach from the guidance does cover all categories that are included in the GAG protocol. So based on existing GAG protocol text, the guidance describes with some details how to assess other categories emissions and how to reduce, let's say, how to reduce these other categories emissions. Well, several types of actions can lead to CO2 reductions, such as, for example, encouraging alternative transport means for freight, alternative travel means, using more travel by train, for instance, and so you will be able to see, well, for the different categories, some potential actions to reduce the associated GHG emissions. Another challenge that we wrote here is related to category 15 investments. This category may represent a significant part of scope 3. And so here again, based on existing GAG protocol text, the guidance describes with some details how to assess investments related emissions. Here it is recommended that a dialogue with investee companies takes place because this can lead to identification and implementation of some reduction levers to actually reduce these category 15 emissions. Last but not least, we wanted to mention that it is important to, let's say, encourage clear and transparent reporting on scope 3 emissions. So you will find in the text of the guidance the items that the reporting of scope 3 shall contain, and this has been written in coherence with ITU TL.1420 recommendation. This recommendation deals with the assessment of GAG emissions of ICT companies, ICT organizations. The guidance states that clear and transparent reporting will help to identify reduction levers because, of course, when you know better where are your emissions, you are more able to model potential future emissions and to identify reduction levers. So this was it for all other categories. And I take the opportunity, some minutes still left, to thank all the participants that have been involved in the preparation of the text on all other categories. And we had in particular strong participation again from Pernia Bergmark from Ericsson, Ahmed Haddad from RCEP, and also Anders Andre from Huawei, and many others. So this is it from my side, Reina.
Thank you, Manuel, for the explanation. I think it seems that there are no questions right now for all other categories. Now we would like to open the floor for any other remaining question that you might have on the guide. It seems that there are no more questions, no more comments. So I would like to give the floor to Stephen just to provide a few closing remarks.
Thanks very much, Raina. So yeah, I hope you found the session useful and that's answered some of the questions you may have about the guidance. It's certainly very useful for us, and I think we'll look to see if we can collect up some of the questions that have been asked both in this session and also the session that we did earlier today, and the answers that we've given for them. Because we've got a pre-published version of the guidance that we've shared with you that hopefully you've seen, but we're also working on a designed version of the guidance as well. So it will have the same content as the pre-published version. I think we could look to maybe include some of the questions that have been asked in these sessions. That might be useful. We can look to add maybe an FAQs to the document. And hopefully the design version, you might find the layout perhaps a bit easier to navigate than the Word document that we shared with you. We should be able to share that published version with you in the second half of April. So thanks once again to all of our presenters today. And Raina, I'll hand back to you to close the session. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Now, just to let you know that I have put in the chat a link where the program of the information session is displayed. Also, in that link, we're also going to share the recording and the presentation that was delivered today. So please feel free to refer to that link and share it with colleagues that might have not had the possibility to join. So thank you so much for all the questions. Thank you so much for the speakers. And we hope to continue working with you and collaborating with you. Have a nice evening and rest of the afternoon. And bye-bye. The session is closed.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye
Thank you.
now.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.